Now that the NFL draft has come and gone, I wanted to give some thoughts on how the Houston Texans did with year one of the DeMeco Ryans era. So overall, I think I'm going to give the draft a B plus. I liked some of the moves that they made. There was a lot of trades. I think most of the picks involved were in some form or fashion part of a trade. So there was a lot of moves that I liked. Some moves I'm questioning a little bit. Overall, I do think it was a B plus. So I'm going to go through each pick and just give my thoughts on each of the picks in order of how they were drafted. So starting out, obviously, we're going to start out with CJ Stroud and the move that was made there. Something else I'm going to do before I keep going as well, I'm going to refer to Lance Zierlein's draft grades. He's one of the more respected draft scouts, if you will. He's actually a Houston guy and follows Houston pretty closely as well. So I'm going to compare the Texans draft picks to Lance's grades, which are done prior to the draft for each of these prospects. And I'm also going to just use that as somewhat of a frame of reference, as a guidance, just as context to how the Texans did. And we'll kind of use that as we talk through these prospects and now these draft picks for the Texans. So starting out, CJ Stroud obviously was drafted second overall by the Texans. Whether you like the pick or not, he is now the quarterback of the future for the Texans for the foreseeable future. Overall, Lance Zierlein had him rated at a 6.7, and in Lance's grading system, that means that that player should eventually be a Pro Bowl level talent. And I think that there's definitely potential for CJ Stroud to get there. I know before the draft, there were some question marks around him, and specifically around a grading system called the S2 test, I believe is what it's called. Really just grading a player's overall reaction time to different things. He didn't grade highly on that test. There was been some more context that has come out since then that had said in some of the categories that really mattered more, he did grade higher. Look, I'm going to trust that if the Texans felt good enough about him and his scores to draft him that highly and invest that high of a pick on him, that they must have gotten to the bottom of that test and also used it in conjunction with other metrics that they use to grade quarterbacks overall. And so they felt good enough to draft him at 1.02, the second overall pick in the draft. And a grade of 6.7, I wanted to go back 5 years at least and just pull names, compare names of other quarterbacks that were graded in a similar fashion from Lance in this regard. If we look back at the draft prior to this one in 2022, really it was more of a down year draft for quarterbacks. You had guys like Kenny Pickett, who graded at a 6.40 from Lance Zierlein. He was drafted in the first round by the Steelers. You had Desmond Ridder, who came in at a 6.36, drafted by the Falcons in the third round. You had Malik Willis, who is now quickly becoming an afterthought in Tennessee, graded as a 6.41. Now that Tennessee has drafted Will Levis. But if we look at the year prior to that, we had 2021, where you had names like Trevor Lawrence, who was clearly a top prospect coming out. He was graded as a 7.40, which is really a can't-miss level grade of a prospect for quarterbacks. In 2021, you also had Zach Wilson at a 6.5, Trey Lance at a 6.47. We have to go back to 2020 to start to get to a prospect that was in the 6.7 something range. Again, CJ Stroud was a 6.70. Tua Tagovailoa was graded at a 6.77. So could be an interesting comparison from a potential standpoint, from a grading standpoint in that regard. Also from that draft, someone graded a little lower, but also at a similar pick in the draft. This was at in the sixth pick overall in the 2020 draft was Justin Herbert. He was graded at a 6.45 from Lance Zierlein. If we go to the year before that, in 2019, we see that Kyler Murray was graded at a 6.8, Dwayne Haskins at a 6.7. Year before that, 2018, we have Baker Mayfield at a 6.70 and Josh Rosen at a 6.70. So It's somewhat of a mixed bag when you start talking about quarterbacks in that 6.7 something range. You have on one hand guys like Kyler Murray, you have Tua Tagovailoa, can't pronounce his name correctly at the moment. Even Baker Mayfield, who was serviceable to a degree in Cleveland. At the same time, though, Baker Mayfield now is seeing his career have some bumps in the road. Dwayne Haskins has never really turned out to much. So I think it remains to be seen, obviously, what sort of quarterback that CJ Stroud will become. I think there's a lot to like about CJ Stroud. I think at pick number 2, it was, I think a solid option. So I'm going to grade it as a good pick. I really don't know what else you really would have done there unless you go something like Will Anderson and then punt on the quarterback selection to see who's there at number 12, maybe later in the draft. But really, I think at the end of the day, it's going to be, from a pick standpoint, it makes sense for the Texans. They need a quarterback. CJ Stroud sitting there. There's a lot to like about CJ Stroud, so they go with it. Certainly, part of taking him number 2 overall was so that other teams like the Titans, which it was rumored the Titans were trying to trade up to number 3, had the Texans gone Will Anderson at number 2 to get CJ Stroud. Part of that was to ensure that the Texans could get CJ Stroud, and then, of course, they make the move up to Will Anderson. So we will move on to Will Anderson right now. Will Anderson, I think, moving up to number 3, although a lot of draft capital was shipped out to go get Will Anderson at number 3, I think, look, if DeMeco Ryans sees Will Anderson as a cornerstone piece on defense, and if the Texans overall see CJ Stroud as the quarterback of the future on offense, to get that in the first round of the draft, using the picks from the Cleveland Browns that they shipped over for the Deshaun Watson trade. And I'm actually going to backtrack real quick because the picks actually, Houston has retained those picks for next year, which is a first rounder and a third rounder. And Houston gave their own picks in this trade, which we will obviously see where those picks end up landing. However, you had extra draft capital from that trade, which I think allowed the Texans some leeway to say, hey, we have these extra picks, we have these guys sitting here in the draft that we think can be important pieces for this franchise moving forward. Let's use some of this extra draft capital in this draft and in next year's draft to make these deals happen, to get CJ Stroud, to get Will Anderson, and we'll go from there. So, time will tell how well of a job, well of a trade that was. Maybe the Texans grossly overpaid for a quarterback that may struggle to become a starter. Maybe they paid the right amount to find their guy who will be the franchise quarterback moving forward, and maybe Will Anderson will be just an absolute stud on the edge there at defensive end. So obviously, time will tell. I think overall, those moves play into my B+ rating, and we'll talk about these other moves here in a minute as well, and why I didn't go full A rating. But I think at the end of the day, Texans were aggressive. They were going after guys that clearly they feel good about, and so they made moves happen. They had the extra draft capital, and they went after the guys that they wanted to go after. So Texans start the draft with back-to-back picks, CJ Stroud, Will Anderson. I personally love it for DeMeco Ryans. I love that he can come in. He has a cornerstone player, an edge rusher on defense that he gets to work with, and then he and that coaching staff now have a franchise quarterback that they can develop and pour into. So I love it from that standpoint for DeMeco Ryans. After those picks, the Texans didn't make another pick until the very end of the second round. And the Texans did have definitely some holes across the roster and across the depth chart that they were looking to fill. One of those was center. And the next pick the Texans made was Juice Scruggs. And Juice Scruggs, I think, at the very least, will be a solid interior lineman and a solid center. I, in some ways, thought this potentially was a little bit of a reach, but clearly the Texans saw something in Juice Scruggs that made them want to make this pick and want to go after him. Overall, from a rating standpoint, Lance rated him at a 6.21. Really, for centers, that's actually a pretty common range for centers to be in from Lance's grading system. You're gonna find centers kind of in the 6.2 to 6.3, maybe 6.4 range. But the thing that got me when I looked at this pick is there was 3 other centers that were rated 6.22, 6.20, 6.19. And these centers went later in the draft. One went in the 3rd round to Washington, one went in the 5th round to Seattle, and one went into the 6th round to Cleveland. So it feels like this pick was a little bit of a reach. However, I know the Texans have or had a hole at center on their roster. And clearly the Texans also value certain things, leadership qualities in guys, maybe even sometimes a little bit to a fault, with Nick Caserio running things. And clearly they saw something in Juice Scruggs, who is a former team captain, that made them want to make this pick. I think Juice also, the appeal with him is he's a versatile interior lineman. So he I think will project as a center. I think he could, shift out towards a guard position if it ever came to that situation. But overall, at 6'3", 301 pounds, he'll be an interior lineman. And there's, I guess, potentially you just matched your franchise quarterback with the center for the foreseeable future. So maybe that was some of the thought process there. If we're gonna go get a quarterback, let's go get the center and make that relationship happen early on, because oftentimes that is an important relationship to make. So they go with Juice Scruggs. That's one of the examples of a pick where I don't think it was an A-level pick, but I don't think it was necessarily a bad pick either. I think at the very least, Juice will be a solid interior lineman, and we'll see what sort of level he can get to over the course of his career. Next pick came in the 3rd round with the 6th overall pick. Houston's own Tank Dell was selected. And to me, I had mixed feelings about this pick. I know Tank Dell is a very electric player. He is someone who, in the NFL, I think at the very least can be somewhat of a gadget guy, can be a special teams threat as a returner, and he'll most likely be a slot receiver in the NFL. I'm hesitant on this pick for 2 reasons. One is Tank's size. He's not a big receiver. He measured in at 5'8" and 165 pounds at the combine. There's not really a lot of wide receivers in the NFL that really make a huge impact at that size. And so that is going to be a concern for Tank. The other thing that I was kind of considering here was there were still other receivers on the board that had a little bit better NFL frame and still brought some of those elements that Tank is going to bring to the receiver position. A couple names, for example, were Jalen Hyatt and Josh Downs. Those players, those receivers were drafted after Tank Dell. So again, this must be a pick that the Texans, they identified something unique with Tank Dell, and that's the motivation to go grab him. I think also in thinking of the current Texans depth chart, you have Nico Collins, who's going to project as is projecting as an outside receiver. Sorry. And you also have the potential for John Mechie to come back after his bout with cancer recently. And so, those 2 players likely are outside receivers. Tank Dell likely translates to a slot receiver for the Texans. And then again, he probably also does double duty as a return specialist and just as a gadget guy on offense as well. So I was okay with that pick. Remains to be seen how it plays out for Houston. Tank certainly has the speed and the quickness and the electricity to be a threat and a weapon at the next level. We'll see how he holds up from a size and frame standpoint, and if there's any limitations with this size overall. From here, Houston goes and selects another edge rusher named Dylan Horton out of TCU. I thought there was an interesting stat here. Dylan led the Big 12 in sacks with 10. He happened to, and this is in 2022, happened to have tied Will Anderson with 10 sacks overall in 2022 as well. Just thought that was kind of a funny little stat there. I thought this was another pick that potentially could have been a little bit of a reach. Dylan was projected to be more of a 5th round sort of selection. Not many scouting services projected him to be an early contributor as a starter, more of a backup depth player, certainly a special teams player. Lance had him ranked as a 5.99, and for Lance's grading system, that is an above average backup. So drafting Dylan Horton in the early 4th round, where you still potentially could go get guys that can make impacts as starters, was a little interesting, but I'm kind of going to defer to DeMeco Ryans on this pick. I think when you're talking about edge players, when you're talking about guys that are going to play outside and rush the passer, and you have someone like DeMeco Ryans in that room who's going to have, as much of influence as anyone in making these picks, I'm going to trust him that he sees something in Dylan where he thinks he could potentially work on or mold him into ideally an impact pass rusher. Dylan has decent size at 6'4" and 257 pounds. Obviously, at the next level, he'll probably beef up another 5, 10, 15 pounds if he can, if his frame can handle it. So it remains to be seen what sort of impact Dylan will have. At the very least, he'll probably be a depth player, a special teams player. Maybe he comes in as a pass rushing specialist in some sort of unit that gets deployed in that way. But I'm going to defer to DeMeco with this pick, drafting him in the 4th round, where Dylan really projected more as a 5th round sort of player overall. From here on out, I thought the Texans made really solid picks. I like the pick of Henry To'oTo'o out of Alabama, the inside linebacker. Overall, he is, what's funny actually, Lance has him graded at 6.16. The player he compared him to was Christian Kirksey, who is a current Texans linebacker. So I think Henry will come in and certainly learn behind Kirksey, learn behind Denzel Perryman, who was a recent addition to the Houston Texans in the linebacking room. So I think this is a solid pick. I don't know that Henry will make an immediate impact, and I don't know that he'll ever actually lock down a starting role. But getting him at middle of the 5th round, at the very least, you got some decent depth there. You certainly got a special teams player there. And as someone who played for Alabama, there's something that, he may have some of those elite traits that Nick Saban looks for. And so, maybe he can bring some of that to the NFL and to the Texans defense overall. After Henry, there was another center and interior offensive lineman pick named Jared Patterson, another versatile center guard sort of player. I like this pick overall as well. I think at 6'5", 306, Jared can play center, he can play guard. I think the Texans are probably going to groom him to be just that, to be a versatile interior offensive lineman, to be very solid depth. And then, hey, who knows? Maybe one day he could develop into a starter overall. But I think at this selection, getting him in the middle of the 6th round, the 24th pick overall in the 6th round, was spot on for his value. Lance had him graded as a 5.85. And in that range, that means for Lance's grading system, traits or talent to be above average backup, which, again, 6th round, I think that's exactly what you're looking for at that point in time. 2 picks after this, one was Xavier Hutchinson, a wide receiver out of Iowa State, picked with the 28th pick overall in the 6th round. He will certainly add depth at the wide receiver position. I think he probably projects starting out as a special teamer for the Texans. And then after that was a safety named Brandon Hill, who I think this is going to be, there's potential for this to be a sneaky, impactful pick. Brandon Hill is a safety who was selected by the Texans with the 31st pick in the 7th round. I think he had 5th round grade capital. Lance had him graded at 5.92, which again is going to be in that range of traits or talent to be an above average backup. I think with the right coaching, and I think DeMeco Ryans and his staff could coach Hill up to be this sort of player. I think Brandon Hill could go from a impactful special teams player to a very solid backup player, and potentially one day as an impact starter. I don't think it's going to happen overnight. I think Brandon Hill needs a lot of coaching with his discipline, with his overall coverage reads, but he's an athletic player. And I think when you're talking about the overall traits that this safety will bring from a speed standpoint, from a physicality standpoint, there's definitely some aspects there to work with. And I'll be very curious to see how DeMeco Ryans in this staff can coach him up and what they can do with him to put him in places to succeed early on. And then as time goes on, what sort of defensive back he turns into at the NFL level. So overall, I think the Texans, again, had a B+ draft. I think there's some excitement throughout the draft on different players. Obviously, there was exciting moves made at the top of the draft with C.J. Stroud and Will Anderson. Some of my questions came into the middle of the draft, but hey, that's kind of what the middle of the draft is a lot of times. A lot of the times, the middle of the draft is where you find these diamonds in the rough that initially weren't on people's radars. And sure enough, a 3rd round, a 4th round pick, a 5th round pick, turns into something special. Maybe they become more of an impact starter or an impact role player than was originally thought to be for that player. So I think overall, obviously if CJ Stroud pans out, that's going to be a huge win from this draft. If Will Anderson pans out like everyone is expecting him to, that'll be another obvious win from this draft. Where I think the potential, where the excitement for this draft class comes in are guys like Juice Scruggs. Can he be the starting center of the future for the Texans? Tank Dell, can he carve out a role as a legit weapon on offense in the NFL moving forward? Dylan Horton, does he turn into a legit edge rusher at the NFL level? Henry To'oTo'o, is he going to become an impact linebacker at this level? Jarrett Patterson, is he going to be more than just depth overall? So I think the picks between the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th round, that's really where the intrigue for me comes into play. Once you get past the CJ Stroud overall question mark for him and his career, and I think again, there's certainly potential here. There's certainly things to be excited about with the draft, and there's certainly some question marks, as there always are when it comes to draft classes and draft picks overall. So those are my thoughts. Next up will be the rookie mini camps, so we'll get to see early returns or early news on these rookie picks as we get into training camp, and then as we somewhat quickly begin to approach the preseason and the NFL season overall. So hope you enjoyed that video. We'll continue this coverage as we get closer to the Houston Texans 2023 campaign under new head coach DeMeco Ryans. And again, hey, thank y'all very much. Signing out.